Apache leader mockingly gave a cowboy his blind and broken daughter, but he gave her his last name. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The year was 1882. The trading post stood at the edge of the desert like a rough scar on the land. Sun-bleached planks, a leaning roof, a corral half-fallen from neglect. It was where the settlers and the Apache tribe met when they had to. No one came here for friendship, only necessity. Caleb Rohr came because he needed nails, a new whetstone, and sacks of flour. His tools were wearing thin, and the winter had eaten through his supplies. He was a carpenter by trade, but these days he built whatever folks paid him for: tables, coffins, a door frame if they had the money. He lived alone, outside town, in a cabin he had raised with his own hands. He kept to himself, speaking only when needed, a habit born of grief. His wife and child had been killed during a raid 4 years back. Since then, he avoided most people because people carried questions, and he had no answers left. The Apache came for tobacco, whiskey, iron pots, and ammunition. Their chief, a heavy-set man with a sharp gaze, enjoyed toying with the settlers, pushing their nerves, testing boundaries. On this day, his attention drifted toward Caleb. The quiet carpenter stood near the back of the group, arms folded, watching the exchange without a word. Anika stood a little apart from the others. She was the daughter of the chief, but not favored. Years ago, a fall from a horse had ruined her leg. One eye clouded soon after from infection. She was 24 now, and most of her people called her broken. She knew the whispers, knew the way men glanced with pity or scorn. She hated it, though she had learned to keep her face blank. The negotiations dragged. Tempers rose. Laughter cut through the air when the chief suddenly pushed Anika forward. "This one," the chief said, his voice thick with derision, "is blind and lame. Worthless to us. Perhaps the carpenter will take her. He has no woman." Two broken things together. The settlers chuckled, some nervously, some with cruelty. The words stung Anika, though she did not flinch outwardly. Her chest tightened. Heat spread across her face. She had always feared this day would come, that she would be used as a tool for mockery. Caleb looked at her. His expression hardly changed, but behind his stillness he felt the weight of it. He saw the torn dress at her shoulders, the uneven way she shifted her stance to ease her bad leg. He also saw her jaw locked in quiet defiance. Something twisted inside him, anger, not loud, but heavy. He knew what it was to be mocked, to be treated as less. The chief expected Caleb to laugh with them or refuse her outright. That was the joke. But Caleb spoke, his voice low and flat. "I'll take her." The words silenced the crowd. Even the settlers' laughter died. The chief's face darkened with surprise. Anika's stomach turned. She had not expected anyone to accept. Her first thought was fear. What would this man do to her? Men were not kind, especially to women already marked as weak. She braced herself, waiting for the cruelty to begin. Caleb stepped forward. He placed his hand on her arm, not rough, not lingering, just steady enough to guide her. She stiffened, unsure whether to resist, but his grip was controlled, respectful, not claiming. The crowd parted as he led her away. Boots shifted in the dirt. Some men spat tobacco, muttering. Others stared, confused. Caleb kept walking, silent as always. They reached his wagon. He helped her climb up. His hand was strong, but he let go quickly, as if careful not to make her feel trapped. She lowered herself onto the bench, her heart beating hard. She didn't trust him, not yet, but there was something different in his manner, something that unsettled her because it lacked the hunger she had grown used to seeing in men's eyes. Caleb climbed in beside her, picked up the reins, and set the horses moving. He didn't speak. He never spoke unless needed. His mind was busy, though. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't come to take in another person, let alone a woman given as an insult. But he couldn't walk away. He told himself it was decency, nothing more. He knew better. Part of him had seen the same loneliness in her that lived in him. The wagon creaked over the dry road, carrying them away from the trading post. Behind them, The voices grew faint, then vanished into the desert wind. Anika kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her throat was dry, her body tense. She expected questions, commands, something. None came. Only the sound of the horses and the steady creak of the wheels. She stole a glance at him with her good eye. His jaw was unshaven, his skin lined from sun and years of hard labor. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon. She could not tell what kind of man he was, but the silence between them felt different than the silence of mockery. It was heavy, yes, but not cruel. For the first time that day, a small thread of relief wound through her fear. She didn't dare hope, but she noted the difference. The desert stretched wide ahead. Neither of them spoke, and yet both felt the weight of a new beginning they had not chosen but could not turn from. The wagon wheels groaned as they left the trading post behind. The desert stretched wide, scattered with brush and dry arroyos, the sun dipping lower until the sky bled orange. Caleb kept the horses steady, eyes forward, his jaw set. Anika sat rigid beside him, hands locked in her lap, torn fabric brushing against her arms. She did not know where he was taking her or what he wanted from her. That question burned in her chest like dry whiskey. She broke the silence first, her voice low, unsteady. "Where are we going?" Caleb shifted slightly, not looking at her. "My place. Outside town. You'll be safe there." Safe. The word landed strangely. She had not heard it used for her in years. Still, she doubted it. She studied him with her good eye, measuring every movement. His clothes were plain, sleeves rolled, hands rough and marked from work. His silence wasn't sharp like her father's, wasn't drunk like the settler's laughter. It was heavy, cautious. She could not read him fully, and that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. As the wagon rolled, her leg ached from the jostling. She shifted and winced, drawing his attention for the first time. His eyes flicked to her, then to her legs. Not lingering, not searching, only noticing. He slowed the horses slightly, enough to ease the ride. That simple act confused her more than any words. By the time night reached them, the land grew colder. A cabin appeared on a rise beyond a line of pines, smoke faint from a chimney. His homestead was small but solid. Walls tight, roof patched carefully, shutters latched. Beside it stood a shed and a stack of split wood. Everything bore the mark of a man who worked with his hands and kept to himself. Caleb stopped the wagon. He climbed down, then reached to help her. She hesitated. His hand waited, not forcing. Finally, she let him guide her down, her limp making the step heavier than she wanted to show. His grip steadied her just long enough, then released. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and smoke. Sawdust clung to the plank floor. Tools lined the walls, chisels, planes, saws, hung with a craftsman's precision. A rough-hewn table stood at the center, 2 chairs beside it. Shelves held jars of beans and dried corn. A cot was pushed against one wall, blankets folded neatly. The place was plain, but it breathed of work and solitude. Anika stayed near the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the lamplight. She expected a command, some declaration of what he wanted her for. Instead, Caleb lit another lamp and set it on the table. "You can sit," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. She didn't move. "Why did you take me?" His hand paused over the lamp wick. He looked at her, long enough that she almost turned away. "Because I wasn't going to leave you there," he said simply. The answer wasn't enough to silence her doubts, but it was more than she expected. She lowered herself into a chair, her leg throbbing, her fingers tightening against her knees. Caleb moved with slow purpose. He set water to boil on the stove, sliced off pieces of dried venison, laid bread on the table. He did not speak much, but every motion was careful, deliberate, as though making it clear she wasn't about to be thrown aside. She watched him, suspicious but tired, hunger gnawing at her stomach. When he finally slid a plate toward her, she hesitated. Men had used food as payment before. She looked at him hard. He only sat across from her, eating his share in silence. She picked up the bread, chewing slowly, waiting for the demand that never came. Her shoulders loosened slightly, though her chest remained tight. She asked again, softer this time. "Why me?" Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. his eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table. Your father wanted to shame you. And me, I wasn't going to give him that. For the first time since the trading post, heat filled her eyes. She blinked hard, unwilling to let the tears show. She had expected cruelty, mockery, or indifference. She had not expected to be defended, even in such a quiet way. He didn't push her with more words. He finished his food, rose, and pulled another blanket from a chest. He laid it across the cot, then gestured slightly. You take the bed. I'll use the floor. The words unsettled her again. Men did not usually offer her dignity, not after seeing her limp and the torn neckline of her dress. She didn't trust it fully, but she couldn't ignore the exhaustion pressing down on her bones. She lowered herself onto the cot, pulling the blanket close, her body tense even as she lay down. Caleb spread his own blanket near the stove, stretching out on the floorboards without complaint. He folded his arms across his chest, staring at the ceiling. He had not planned for this, but his decision felt fixed. He didn't see her as broken. He saw her as someone cast aside, and he understood that too well. The cabin grew quiet. Outside, coyotes howled in the dark. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of firewood and two sets of breathing, separate but under the same roof. For Anika, fear still lingered. For Caleb, resolve had settled in. Neither knew what would come next, but the night ended not in humiliation, as she had expected, but in a silence that felt different, one that held space rather than scorn. The morning light crept through the cabin's small window, falling across rough boards and dust motes. Anika stirred on the cot, her back stiff, her legs heavy with the ache that always came after restless sleep. She blinked her good eye against the light, the other still clouded, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the smell of wood smoke and cedar reminded her. The carpenter's cabin. The man who had taken her from the trading post without words of ownership or scorn. Her gaze shifted. Caleb was already up. He moved quietly across the room, pulling on his boots, a saw resting against his shoulder. His bedroll lay neatly folded by the stove, as if he had never been there at all. He gave her a glance, no more than a second, and nodded. Coffee on the stove, bread on the table. I'll be in the shed, he said, his voice graveled but calm. She watched him step outside, closing the door behind him. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to demand, to claim, to use her the way men always had. Yet his first words of the day were about bread and coffee. Her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten much the night before. She rose carefully, her legs stiff, and made her way to the table. The bread was coarse, but filling, the coffee bitter. She ate slowly, glancing toward the door, wondering what his game was. Why bring her here? Why treat her differently than others had? When she finished, she began to study the cabin properly. The shelves held jars of beans, flour sacks, and dried venison. A row of wooden bowls sat stacked, each carefully sanded smooth. She noticed a rocking chair in the corner, its back carved with simple but deliberate lines. This man lived with care. Nothing in the room was for show. Every piece had purpose, every tool had its place. Curiosity gnawed at her. She rose and limped to the window, peering outside. The shed door stood open, and inside she could see him at work. Caleb bent over a plank, his plane gliding steady, curls of wood piling at his boots. His sleeves were rolled high, forearms corded with muscle, movements measured. He worked like a man who found order in the grain, who relied on his hands more than words. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt something ease inside her chest. She had been treated as a burden for so long that seeing a man simply work without looking at her as weight or shame was disarming. Hours passed before he returned. When he came in, he set a small stool against the wall, freshly built, smooth at the edges. He didn't announce it or explain. He only nodded toward it, as though leaving her something she might use. She didn't sit, not yet, but she touched it, running her fingers over the polished wood. It was the first thing anyone had made with her in mind for as long as she could remember. You build, she said softly, not a question, but an observation. He looked at her, his jaw working slightly. That's all I do, he answered. She wanted to ask why he had taken her in, what had driven him to step forward at the trading post, but fear kept her quiet. Instead, she asked, "Do you live here alone?" His eyes flicked away. Been 4 years now. He didn't add more, but the weight in his voice told her what he left unsaid. Loss, grief, something carved into him deeper than scars. She didn't press. Later, she tried to help. She gathered kindling near the stove, though her leg made bending difficult. She set a pot of beans to simmer. Her hands trembled at first, but she forced herself to move, to contribute. When Caleb came in again and saw the pot steaming, his gaze lingered on it for a moment. A nod followed. Nothing more, but it was enough to tell her he noticed. As dusk settled, they sat at the table. She ate quietly, still waiting for demands, for the trap she was sure would spring. Instead, the only sounds were the creak of chairs and the crackle of fire. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning since the night before. "Why didn't you leave me there?" He paused, bread halfway to his mouth. His eyes lifted to hers. "Because I know what it feels like to be left." The words hung heavy in the air. She lowered her gaze, her chest tightening, unsure what to say. No man had spoken to her like that before. Not with pity, not with hunger, but with recognition. When the night grew late, he spread his bedroll on the floor again, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. For the first time in years, she did not fall asleep fearing the sound of footsteps in the dark. She still didn't trust him, not fully, but something had shifted. The questions that remained unanswered still gnawed at her. Did he expect her to stay? Would he one day grow tired and cast her out? But for that night, with the fire warming the cabin and his silence steady instead of cruel, she let her eyes close. It was not trust yet, but it was the beginning of rest. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though it was still strained, still new. Anika rose early, slower than Caleb, her bad legs stiff from the night. She watched him each morning pull on his boots, lift his tools, and step outside without wasted words. At first, she thought he left her behind to remind her she was unwanted, but she soon realized he worked that way with everything, focused, deliberate, sparing his voice as though each word cost him something. She tried to keep herself busy. She boiled beans, swept the sawdust from the floor, mended his shirts where the seams had worn thin. Her fingers trembled over the needle, clumsy at first, but steadier with each attempt. These small tasks gave her purpose. Yet every time he returned from the shed, she felt the same knot in her stomach. Would today be the day he revealed what he truly wanted from her? The answer never came, and his silence confused her more than any demand. He would glance at the pot on the stove, nod once, and sit to eat. No harsh words, no mocking laughter, no lingering eyes on her torn dress. He ate, he worked, he rested. The simplicity was unsettling because it was unfamiliar. On the fourth evening, while she stirred a pot over the fire, she found her courage. "You don't ask me to leave," she said quietly, her voice breaking the steady crackle of wood. Caleb looked up from the piece of timber he had been carving smooth. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but thought. "I don't take in someone to send them out the next day." She turned to face him fully. "Then what am I to you?" The question slipped out sharper than she meant. Fear was tangled in it, the memory of being passed around like nothing more than a joke. His jaw worked. He set the timber down carefully, as though buying himself a moment. "You're someone who deserved better than what they gave you." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe it, but belief didn't come easy. She returned to the pot, stirring with more force than needed, her good eye blinking fast against the sting that threatened her. That night, she moved more slowly than usual toward the cot. Her leg buckled on the way, the day's weight too much. Caleb was there before she hit the floor, his hand catching her arm, steadying her. The strength in his grip was undeniable, but it wasn't possessive. He helped her upright, guided her to sit. For a moment, she sat frozen, his hand still on her arm, the warmth of it cutting through her tension. She lifted her head, searching his face. He looked at her, not with pity, not with hunger, but with something steadier, concern, maybe respect. The air between them felt different. Her heart beat fast, reckless. She did something she hadn't dared in years. She lifted her hand and placed it against his chest, her palm flat against the rough fabric of his shirt. His heartbeat was strong beneath her fingers. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he leaned down, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. His lips touched hers, light at first, almost cautious. Her breath caught. She had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with patience, never without expectation. When he drew back, she kept her hand on his chest, grounding herself in the steadiness of him. The fire cracked, shadows moving across the cabin walls. She felt exposed in her torn dress, the neckline frayed, her body no secret to any man's eye. Yet Caleb hadn't looked at her that way. His gaze never dropped below her face. The thought rattled her. What did it mean that he could see her and not reduce her to her curves, her limp, her scars? "I don't understand you," she whispered. "You don't have to," he answered quietly. "Not tonight." He stepped back then, returning to his bedroll by the stove, leaving her shaken but not in fear. She lay down on the cot, her fingers brushing her lips where the warmth of his kiss still lingered. For the first time in years, she felt the sharp edge of fear dull into something else, something she couldn't name yet, but it was enough to keep her eyes open long into the night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this man's silence was the kind that built, not the kind that destroyed. The questions listeners might still hold. Why hadn't he asked for her name? Why hadn't she asked for his story? Found answers in the stillness. She knew his name from the trading post, Caleb Rourke, the carpenter who had buried his wife and child. He knew hers from the chief's lips, Anika, the broken daughter. Both carried scars no one needed to speak aloud yet. Their silence filled what questions could not. And as the fire dimmed, that silence felt less like distance and more like the start of something that might last. The following days settled into a new pattern, heavier with unspoken weight after the kiss they had shared. Anika felt it every time she moved around him, every time her fingers brushed the fabric of his shirts while she mended, every time he passed close enough for her to catch the scent of wood and smoke clinging to him. Caleb spoke little of it, almost as if it hadn't happened, but his silence wasn't rejection. It was a silence that seemed to wait, giving her space to decide what it meant for her. Winter pressed hard against the walls of the cabin. Snow came in thin sheets at first, then thicker, covering the pines and hemming them into their small world. Caleb cut wood every morning, his axe splitting through the frozen air, the sound carrying into the cabin where Anika listened while she worked. She could no longer imagine a day without that sound. It had become the rhythm of safety. One morning she asked, voice low, "Do you want me to leave when spring comes?" The question had lingered since her first night, and she could not hold it back any longer. Caleb paused in his work, setting down the block of wood he had been shaping. His eyes stayed on the grain for a long moment before lifting to hers. "If you want to go, you'll go. But I didn't bring you here to send you away." The answer cut deep in her doubt. She turned back to the beans she had been rinsing, her fingers trembling with the relief she didn't want to show. For years, men had decided her fate without asking. His words, simple as they were, gave her something she hadn't felt since childhood, a choice. Her limp made tasks harder, but she refused to sit idle. She hauled water from the well with slow, uneven steps, her arms straining but determined. She cooked stews with what little they had, learning the taste of his quiet approval when he ate without complaint. Caleb, for his part, never commented on her gait or her clouded eye. When she stumbled, his hand appeared at her elbow, steady and sure, then released the moment she was upright again. One evening, after hours spent repairing a broken table leg, Caleb brought something into the cabin that stopped her breath. A chair, sturdy and carved with care, its arms wide enough to rest against, its seat built lower so her leg wouldn't strain. He set it near the fire, wiped the dust from it with a rag, and stepped back. "It's for you," he said simply. Anika touched the smooth surface, her fingers tracing the lines. "You built this for me?" He gave a single nod. "Figured you'd sit easier that way." She sat slowly, testing it. The weight held, her body settling without pain. A warmth spread through her chest, unexpected and sharp. No one had ever shaped wood for her comfort, not once. She looked at him, and though his face was guarded, she could see the truth in his eyes. This was not pity. This was care. That night she worked on his shirts again. Her needle no longer slipped as often, though her fingers bore small red marks from practice. She folded each mended piece carefully. When she handed them back to him, her voice was steadier than before. "I'm not useless here." His gaze lingered on her face, then dropped to the shirt in his hands. "Never said you were." The firelight caught the planes of his face, the scar along his arm, the roughness that came from years of surviving alone. She wondered then if his silence had always been protection, for himself and now, strangely, for her. When they laid down for the night, she on the cot, he on the floor, the quiet between them was heavier than the wind outside. She touched her lips once, remembering the kiss, and though fear still pressed at the edges of her mind, another feeling began to take root. For the first time in years, her brokenness did not define her. It gave her reason to see the way he stayed, the way he built, the way he refused to turn away. What listeners may have wondered before, why he had chosen her at all, what he truly intended, was answered not in words, but in the chair by the fire and the way he gave her dignity without asking for anything in return. And for Anika, that dignity felt like the first plank in a foundation that might hold. The snow thickened in the weeks that followed, piling high against the cabin walls, muting the world outside until it felt as though only the two of them existed. Days shrank into early dusk, and nights stretched long beside the fire. In that stillness, their bond grew, not through declarations but through the quiet weight of routine. Anika moved with more confidence around the cabin now. She used the chair Caleb had built, her leg finding rest when it needed it, and from that chair she worked with steady hands, mending clothes, peeling potatoes, tending the fire when he returned from cutting wood. She still feared being seen as a burden, but every time Caleb noticed her work and gave a small nod, the fear eased. One evening after a long day of sawing and hauling, Caleb came in later than usual, his shoulders heavy with fatigue, snow crusted along the hem of his coat. Anika rose from her chair despite her limp and took the coat from him. The gesture surprised him. He wasn't used to anyone tending to him. She hung it near the fire, her fingers brushing against the rough wool. "You work too hard," she said quietly, almost testing the sound of her own voice in such a personal remark. Caleb looked at her, his eyes tired but steady. "Work's all I know." Her chest tightened. She saw the truth in that. How he filled his silence with labor, how he carried grief in the calluses of his hands. She wanted to tell him he wasn't alone anymore, but the words caught. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. He sat heavily on the stool, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed for a moment. She stood beside him, her hand hovering before she finally placed it on his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't shrug her away. Slowly, he lifted his head, and his eyes met hers, his steady, hers searching, one good, one clouded. The fire cracked. The wind howled against the shutters. In that space, he reached up, his rough fingers wrapping around her wrist, guiding her hand from his shoulder to his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her palm, grounding her. She didn't pull away. He rose then, standing close enough that her breath caught. He moved slowly, giving her room to choose. She tilted her face up, her good eye fixed on him, and when his lips found hers, the kiss carried more weight than the first. It was firmer, surer, protective without being demanding. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. She pressed against him, feeling the strength in his chest, the steadiness that had become her anchor. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was more than the broken daughter given away as a joke. She was a woman being held, not pitted, not used. When they finally parted, her breath was uneven. She stepped back half a pace, her cheeks flushed. "Why do you treat me this way?" she asked, the question spilling before she could stop it. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked into the fire before answering. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and have nothing left. No one deserves to be treated like they're less than human." His words struck deep, sharper than any touch. She had wondered, as others might, why he bore such quiet, why his eyes carried so much weight. Now it was clearer. He wasn't simply a solitary man by choice. He was a man shaped by grief, surviving in silence. She thought of the grave markers she had seen on the ridge near his land when they first passed. She had guessed they were his kin. Now she knew for certain. The questions unspoken until now. Why he lived alone, what kept him from remarrying, why he had accepted her at all, were answered without him needing to say more. He had chosen her not to fill a void, but because he refused to repeat the cruelty of others. That night, she lay on the cot, unable to sleep, her lips still burning from his kiss. Caleb stretched out on the floor, as always, his back turned to the fire. She listened to his breathing, steady, unbroken, and realized she no longer feared the footsteps in the dark. For the first time in years, she felt safer beside a man than she had ever thought possible. As her eyes closed at last, one thought stayed with her. Staying was no longer a matter of survival. It was becoming something she wanted. The storm passed, leaving the land blanketed in white, the air sharp and still. The cabin creaked under the weight of snow on the roof, but inside, warmth held steady. Anika sat in the chair Caleb had built, her legs stretched out, the firelight painting her face in soft glow. The kiss they had shared days before lingered between them like an unfinished sentence. She felt it every time his eyes brushed hers, every time his hand lingered a second longer when steadying her. Caleb returned from the shed carrying a stack of split wood. Snow clung to his shoulders, his breath heavy with frost. He stomped the boots clear and stacked the logs by the stove. Anika studied him in silence, noting the small details listeners might have wondered about earlier. How he kept food through winter, how he managed the work alone. She had begun to see it all. The jerky he smoked, the flour he rationed, the traps he set beyond the tree lane. His survival was not luck, it was discipline. "You'll wear yourself down," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He shrugged, pulling off his gloves. "Work keeps me standing." Anika pushed herself to rise, steadying on her bad leg. She crossed the room with measured steps and reached for one of the logs. Her arm strained, but she carried it to the stove and set it in place. Caleb watched, his jaw tightening as if torn between stopping her and letting her prove herself. When she turned back, there was something in his eyes, respect, unspoken but clear. The days grew into a rhythm that no longer felt forced. Anika insisted on taking part in chores. She hauled small buckets of water, kneaded dough, even helped mend a broken hinge under Caleb's watchful eye. Each task reminded her she was capable, not a burden. Her limp slowed her, but did not stop her. Caleb, without saying much, adjusted quietly, carrying the heavier loads, slowing his stride to match hers, guiding her through the uneven snow with a hand at her elbow. One afternoon, as the light thinned early, he handed her a small knife, its handle worn smooth. "If you're going to be here, you should know how to handle one," he said. She hesitated. No one had ever trusted her with more than a pot or a needle. She gripped it carefully, the weight unfamiliar. Caleb stood behind her, his hands guiding hers as he showed her how to cut leather straps for binding. She could feel his breath near her ear, the steady warmth of him close, but his focus stayed on the task. It wasn't a game for him. It was teaching, plain and serious. She leaned into that steadiness, her fingers trembling less as she worked. Later that evening, while she sat sewing near the fire, she spoke without looking up. "Do people ever come here? To your cabin?" Caleb was sharpening a chisel. He paused, then answered, "Not often. Most folks in town keep their distance. Some think I want it that way. Maybe I do. Because of what you lost," she said softly. He looked at her, surprised she had spoken it aloud. "Because people don't know what to do with a man who carries graves in his past," he admitted. Her throat tightened. She had carried her own kind of grave, alive but cast off, shamed by her own people. In that moment, she realized they were bound not by pity, but by the shared weight of being left behind. The question that might have lingered for listeners, how Anika truly saw him now, found its answer when she set her sewing aside, rose from the chair, and crossed the room. She placed her hand gently on his scarred forearm, her good eye fixed on him. Then they don't see you for what you are. Caleb's chest rose with a quiet breath. He didn't pull away. His hand turned, rough fingers brushing against hers. For him, it was more than touch. It was acceptance. For her, it was the first time she had reached without fear of rejection. That night, as the fire dimmed, they lay in their separate places, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was full. She no longer questioned why he had taken her in. The answer lived in every chair he built, every shirt she mended, every log he split, every meal she cooked. It lived in the simple act of staying. And for the first time, Anika believed she belonged under that roof, not as a mockery, not as a burden, but as part of the life they were building together. By late winter, the snow began to thin, breaking in patches that revealed the hard ground beneath. The air carried a sharp bite still, but there were days when the sun felt stronger, hinting at the season ahead. For Caleb and Anika, life inside the cabin had settled into something that felt steady, almost ordinary. She no longer asked if she would be sent away, and he no longer looked at her like a question he couldn't answer. Their silence had become a language of its own, but the world outside did not forget them. One afternoon, Caleb hitched the wagon to ride into town for nails, salt, and kerosene. Anika, despite her limp, insisted on going with him. She did not want to be hidden away like some shame. Caleb hesitated at first, but saw the determination in her good eye and gave a small nod. The ride was quiet, the horses kicking up slush along the frozen track. Anika's hands clenched the bench beside her, not from fear of Caleb, but from what awaited them among others. She had not stood among settlers since that day her father mocked her, and the thought of their eyes on her again stirred the old shame. Caleb sensed it in her stiff posture. "You don't owe them anything," he said, keeping his eyes ahead. She swallowed hard. "They'll see me as broken." "Then let them," he answered. "Doesn't change what you are here." His hand tapped lightly against the bench between them, a gesture that meant more than words. When they arrived, heads turned. The town was small enough that everyone noticed everything. Whispers rose quickly. A few settlers remembered the day at the post, remembered her father's cruel laughter. Some muttered under their breath about Caleb bringing her home. Others stared openly at her limp, her cloudy eye, the torn dress she still wore despite her attempts at mending. Anika felt the heat rise in her face. Her instinct was to look down, to let shame swallow her, but Caleb's presence steadied her. He walked beside her into the mercantile, broad-shouldered, silent, his hand resting briefly at her back when the doorway narrowed. It was not possession, it was reassurance. Inside, the storekeeper hesitated before speaking, his eyes flicking between Caleb and Anika. "You bringing her here now?" he asked. The tone was edged, not quite hostile, but loaded with curiosity. Caleb's voice was low but firm. "I'm buying nails, salt, and kerosene. Nothing else that needs saying." The man's mouth shut quick enough, and the goods were fetched without further word. Anika stood still, forcing herself not to shrink, not to step back. She saw the way Caleb handled it, direct, unflinching, refusing to let her presence be treated like a spectacle. It gave her the strength to stand tall, or as tall as her leg allowed. When they stepped back onto the street, a pair of young men leaned against the post rail, smirking. "Didn't think you'd keep her, Rourke," one called out. "Figured she'd be gone by now." Caleb didn't slow, but his eyes cut to them, sharp as the edge of a saw. "She's here. That's all you need to know." His voice carried a weight that silenced further comment. For Anika, the words sank deeper than she expected. He had claimed nothing, promised nothing, but he had made it plain she belonged with him, not as a joke, not as a passing burden. The questions some might still hold, whether Caleb truly meant for her to stay, whether she was more than charity, were answered in that moment. He didn't argue her worth. He simply lived as though it were fact. On the ride back, the tension between them shifted. Anika let her hand rest on the bench, closer to his. Caleb glanced at it, then let his own rest nearby. Not touching, not yet, but close enough to feel the warmth. She looked at him, her good eye steady now. "You didn't have to speak for me," she said. Yes, I did, he replied. The cabin welcomed them back with the smell of smoke and cedar. Caleb carried the supplies inside, and Anika followed, her limp slower but her shoulders straighter than before. She felt changed, though the world's judgment had not disappeared. What mattered was how he had stood beside her, how he had stayed when he could have looked away. That night, she worked at the stove while he mended a broken tool by lamplight. When their eyes met across the room, there was no need to fill the silence. Both knew what had been decided without words, that whatever the world thought, they had chosen each other. For the first time, Anika did not feel like someone carried. She felt like someone standing, even if she stood a little uneven. The snow melted slow, turning the hard earth into thick mud before the ground firmed again. Streams ran fuller, the pines brightened, and the air carried the damp scent of thaw. For Caleb and Anika, the shift of season felt like the final proof that winter had not broken them. They had lived side by side through long nights in silence, through fear and doubt, and now spring came as a witness to what they had chosen. Anika moved more easily around the cabin. Her limp was still there, her eyes still clouded, but she no longer let them define her steps. She carried water without hesitation, kneaded bread with strong arms, and hung linens to dry outside in the breeze. Neighbors from town might still whisper, but here, in this space Caleb had built with his hands, she was not broken. She was part of home. Caleb noticed the change in her. Where before she had watched him with suspicion, now she met his gaze with certainty. She no longer asked if she would be sent away, no longer held her breath waiting for cruelty. Each day, she found new ways to take her place in the rhythm of his life, and he found himself relying on her presence more than he admitted. The cabin no longer felt like a workshop for a grieving man. It felt like a house lived in by two. One afternoon, Caleb brought a bundle of cedar boards into the cabin. He laid them on the table, the smell of fresh wood filling the air. Anika watched him puzzled. "What are you building now?" she asked. He rubbed a hand over the grain before answering. "A chest. For your things. Figure you might want more than a corner of the shelf." Her throat tightened. She had so little left. One torn dress, a few small cloths she had mended, nothing else. But the chest meant more than storage. It meant permanence. It meant he expected her to stay. She rose from her chair and stepped toward him, her limp pulling at her side, but her resolve steady. She laid her hand on his arm, her voice low. "You want me here?" Caleb looked at her, his face unreadable at first, then softened by the weight of truth. "I do. I didn't plan for it. Didn't expect it. But I want you here." Her good eye filled, not with shame this time, but with something warmer. She leaned into him, and when his arms came around her, she did not hold back. Their kiss deepened in the quiet of the cabin, no longer cautious or uncertain. It was steady, like the walls around them, like the ground beneath them. That evening, after the fire burned low, they sat together at the table with bread between them. Anika rested her hand against his, fingers lacing without hesitation. Caleb did not pull away. For both of them, it was the answer to questions left unspoken, whether this was charity, whether this was survival only, whether they were bound by mockery. It was none of those things. It was choice. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became something new. Caleb built her a second chair, lighter, easier to move, so she could sit outside when the weather warmed. Anika planted herbs in small pots by the window, their green shoots breaking through the soil. The place bore their mark together, not as alone. Listeners might have wondered if her father or the others would come to reclaim her, to press shame on them again. But no one came. The silence of the desert held them, leaving them to live without intrusion. For the first time, Anika did not fear being dragged back, and Caleb did not fear losing what he had allowed himself to hold. One morning, as they worked side by side, he sanding the chest, she stitching a cloth for its lining. She looked at him and said, "They thought giving me to you was an insult." He glanced up, waiting. She smiled faintly, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. "But they gave me a life instead." Caleb's hands stilled on the board. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he let himself smile fully. It was not wide, but it was real. By spring's full bloom, The two graves on the ridge near his land no longer stood as symbols of loneliness. Caleb visited them with Anika at his side, her hand steady on his arm. He spoke nothing aloud, but in his silence he knew the truth. He had not replaced what was lost. He had built something new. The cabin, once marked by sawdust and grief, now carried the smell of bread, the sound of two voices, the weight of shared labor, and the steady warmth of staying. Caleb Rourke and Anika, the woman once mocked as blind and broken, had become family not by blood or vow, but by choosing not to leave. And as the days stretched long under the New Mexico sun, there was no doubt left. They had turned weakness into strength, not through promises, but through the act of remaining. Two lives bound by the simplest and strongest truth the frontier ever knew. They stayed.